Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, hopefully having an amazing day. In this video, I want to discuss Intel. Specifically, we're going to look at a patent which could be a revolution in how the company, as well as we see the industry at large, produce CPUs, GPUs and other products, and yes, it's really cool stuff, but also how Intel themselves have been putting billions and massively increasing their research and development funds over the past year or so, and how they are planning to regain chip leadership. Now, just a quick bit of history, don't worry, this will only take a few moments, I promise. Basically, for a long time, Intel were pretty much the undisputed kings of CPUs. They had the leadership not only in desktops, but also servers and even things like, workstations for home. Ultimately, AMD had decent products, like they were decent, like the FX 8350, for example. It did get memed on quite a bit, but honestly, it wasn't that bad of a product. I actually took a look at it back in the day. I actually think, I think AMD sent it to us. But ultimately, in single-thread performance, for example, Intel were just the king, and they were king across Haswell, and perhaps even before that, all the way to early Skylake. But then obviously major things changed over at AMD, and one of the most important of those was that Lisa Su, being in charge, made major changes not only to the research and development at the company in terms of the priority, but also just across the board. And this led to products, as all of you know at this point, like the original Zen architecture, which was extremely important, and also has been something that AMD have continued to build on every single iteration. Like Zen 2 was again a major step forward. Zen 3 again has been an absolutely tremendous step forward. And Intel at some point or another just kind of hasn't been as competitive. Now, I do think, to be fair, that Alder Lake has been a great leap forward by Intel, and in my personal opinion, I think CPUs like the 12400 have been absolutely excellent. I actually reviewed the 12400, and in my personal opinion anyway, it's an excellent budget processor. But it's fair to say that they're certainly not in the dominant position that they once were. And one of the reasons behind all of this is lack of research and development funds, and also the priorities of the CEO. Now, Pat Gelsinger is of course in charge over at Intel, and he has basically massively increased the research and development budgets over at Intel. There's a really good article on the Register. I'll, of course, link it in the video description. Long story short, according to their own figures, we see Intel now spend about 15.2 billion US dollars, which is around 20% of the company's entire revenue, which is around 74.7 billion. And that actual figure is up 12% over the research and investment cost of 2020. Now, of course, this is a large amount of money, and ultimately, Pat Gelsinger does, of course, have to answer to shareholders. But I'm going to shock you guys here. So you might want to sit down if you're not already. But if you're in the technology businesses actually creating chips, you need to put money into research and development, because otherwise your competitors are just going to start to leapfrog you. And this is one of the reasons, for example, that Nvidia have been so ahead in GPUs, because AMD's budget, comparatively, was so small. Like, at one point or another, I think that the coffee budget of NVIDIA was probably higher than the entire research and development budget of AMD. Obviously, I'm slightly exaggerating here, but you guys get the point. And so, Intel are now pushing some very interesting technologies, and one of those is actually described in a patent. I'd like to give credit to UnderFox3 on Twitter for the discovery of this patent, and the title of it is Stacked Fork Sheet Transistors. Now, honestly, the patent itself is pretty long. You can, of course, check it out yourself if you want to. But the long and short of it here is that the patent essentially allows you to stack transistors on top of another by basically using walls, if you will, to allow you to do that, and backplanes. Now, you can kind of think of this, and it's not technically 100% accurate what I'm about to describe, but it might help you kind of get an idea of what I mean. So you can kind of think of think the term is bungalow in the US as well, but you know, just a one-story kind of building, like a one-story house, for example. And obviously, at the end of the day, you can make that building bigger, right? You can take more land, but ultimately the footprint, if you will, of the building is getting larger and larger and larger and larger. Or you can add another story on top. So yeah, that basically would increase the square footage of your home, right? If you add a second story or a third or whatever onto the building. And that's kind of what's going on here. And there are a lot of challenges as we start to reduce the size of the transistors, basically, as we shrink the manufacturing process or production process. And it's been, you know, ultimately you're basically putting transistors essentially closer and closer and closer and closer and closer and closer together. And there are a ton of challenges that this starts to produce, not least of which is leaking, like, you know, electricity basically. It's like, oh, actually, I'd rather be over here than here. Again, not 100% technically accurate, but you guys kind of get what I'm going with this. And it's been a problem that honestly is, you know, slowly being fixed. And we're seeing TSMC now, obviously, they've pretty much got their 5nm process pretty much good to go. And Intel are now moving over to things like 3nm, I'm sorry, and they're now starting to move over to 3nm. So, you know, in terms of production, Intel have been essentially quite far behind companies like TSMC, but this is starting to change. In fact, I'm personally hearing that Intel 4 is actually coming on really well at the moment. We actually already have reported that Meteor Lake from Intel has received a power on test, and apparently, from my sources anyway, it's actually coming on really well, Meteor Lake, and obviously it will essentially follow on Raptor Lake. So you get Alder Lake, then you get Raptor Lake, and then you get Meteor Lake. Intel really loves their lakes, don't they? And I'm kind of cautiously optimistic that Intel will be really competitive in the processor arena, because ultimately, again, you know, I love AMD, don't get me wrong, I love Nvidia, but I also want Intel to be successful as well, because at the end of the day, like, yeah, I do know people at Intel or AMD or Nvidia, and, you know, they're really cool people, but I also want us to have really good products, and the only way, of course, that this can happen in the industry is for things to be as competitive as possible. Gelsinger has also been pushing other technology as well. In the earning call, they also mentioned about a long-term path forward with more than 10 times the improvement in density and packaging, and a 30 to 50% improvement in area for transistor scaling. And this is something that was actually presented in a research paper at the International Electron Device Meeting, or IEDM if you prefer. So basically, Intel's plan is pretty simple at this point. Just spend as much money as it can anyway on research and development, and try to catch up or surpass, in some cases, its rivals, particularly when it comes to manufacturing and production. And it's kind of a shame, honestly, that they have been behind in some ways, although perhaps in other ways, in terms of the industry at large, it's perhaps been a good thing that we've seen AMD on top for a while. It's not the first time that we've seen this. If you remember back in the day, we had processors like the K6, I think the original K6 actually outperformed the Pentium. That's a little bit before my time. I didn't have a PC back then, but I believe that's the case in some instructions. And then the K6-2, the K6-3 were decent budget variants against like the Pentium 2, I think. But then AMD really came back with early Athlons. I think that actually outperformed the Pentium 3. And obviously we had the Athlon 64 as well, which would be spanking the Pentium 4. Also, the early Athlon 64s as well were really good, especially against the Pentium 4, which was not exactly perhaps Intel's finest architecture, to be honest with you. But yeah, I'm going to be really interested to watch this one over the next couple of years. I suspect that there's going to be some very interesting things. And also, I just want to reiterate, guys, that Intel's graphics architectures will be debuting this year as well. There's higher performance ones for desktop, obviously Arc, but I do believe that the release schedule between, you know, Gen 1 and Battle Mage is going to not be too long. I'm now being told by multiple people that probably it's going to be like early next year that we're going to see Gen 2 from Intel, and it's going to be massively improved over, you know, this architecture. And I think that, you know, Gen 1, it's not quite like this, but I think in some ways it's kind of like AMD's RDNA 1. You know, they're just kind of putting it out, getting, you know, they're just basically testing a lot of stuff out, because ultimately it's quite a big departure from their previous design. It's the first time that Intel have actually released a big GPU. I mean, I don't really think you can count Larrabee as a release, let's just be honest. But at this point, I'm waffling, so I'm going to let you all go. Thanks very much for checking out the video. There is a second one on the channel today as well, which focuses on AMD, so you can go ahead and check that out. It is, of course, linked in the description of the video. With that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.